You gonna lift that with those little arms? Sweetheart, go home and wash the dishpan smell off your hands before you break your back for garbage.
Delia bent, gripped a cracked block, and lifted it.
You're paying to make this disappear. I'll do it for free.
Bolt turned to the shopmen and grinned.
Look at her, boys. Farm girl thinks junk iron's gonna feed her.
Delia pulled the red notebook from her pocket.
This isn't scrap. You just can't read what it is.
Bolt spat in the gravel and shook his head.
Wreck your back, girl. Nobody in this county wants that pile.
She loaded another block, then another, without a word.
4,000 of them. I'll take every last one.
Bolt laughed and signed the pile away to her.
Enjoy your dead iron, sweetheart. You just robbed yourself.
He didn't know she'd read what that iron really was. The blocks weighed close to 90 pounds apiece, and Delia lifted them the way she'd learned to lift anything heavy. Close to the body, knees under the load, a slow breath out on the rise. Bolt leaned against his own truck with an unlit cigarette behind his ear and watched her fill the flatbed one dead casting at a time. And he wasn't cruel about it. He just couldn't make sense of it. In his world, a person got paid to make scrap disappear. He was standing in that lot precisely because the shop cut him a check every month to haul this pile to the yard in Galena, where it went across a scale and came back as a few dollars a ton. Now here was a young woman from over the Kansas line offering to take the whole thing off his route for nothing. And she was doing his work for him, and she looked glad about it. She was 24 that summer, lean and wiry in a faded olive work shirt with the sleeves rolled, a single dark braid down her back, going gray with iron dust by noon. Her hands were already flecked with it. She had a red spiral notebook in her breast pocket and a pencil stub clipped to the wire, and every so often she stopped, wrote something small, and went back to loading. Bolt asked her once what she kept writing. "Weights," she said, "just weights." He laughed and let it go. Let me tell you about that pile, because you need to understand what it actually was before you can understand why nobody wanted it. Those were engine blocks off farm tractors and irrigation pumps and old road equipment. Gray cast iron, cracked somewhere along a water jacket or a cylinder wall by frost or fatigue. And once an engine block cracks, it is finished as an engine block. There is no welding it back to a pressure-tight vessel that a person would trust. So the shop pulled the crank and the good hardware. And what was left was a heavy, awkward carcass of iron with a fracture running through it. To the shop, it was a disposal cost. To Bolt, it was tonnage. To the county, it was junk, which is a word people use for material whose purpose has ended. And they forget that iron does not have one purpose. Iron has whatever purpose the next person is smart enough to give it. Delia's family farmed 320 acres of wheat in Cherokee County, the flat southeastern corner of Kansas, where the plains start thinking about becoming the Ozarks, and then think better of it. 320 acres of wheat is not poverty, and it is not comfort. It is a life measured in the difference between a good July and a bad one, in the price a distant board of trade sets for your grain while you sleep, in the interest on a note you pray you never have to sign. The Vorhees family had no note, and that was Standard Vorhees's whole religion. He was her father, near 60 that year, tall and raw-boned, and stooped a little at the shoulders. Iron gray hair combed straight back off a deep-lined forehead, watery blue eyes that took their time about everything. He wore the same checked flannel buttoned to the throat in June that he wore in November, and he kept a folded pocket ledger on him the way other men kept a knife. He had a saying, and Delia had heard it her whole life, at the bench, and in the field, and once over a fence post set crooked. You measure twice because the iron doesn't forgive. He meant it about literal iron, a plow point, a gate hinge, a wheel rim, but he meant it about everything else too. About money, and about promises, and about the distance between what a thing looks like and what a thing is. Measure twice. The iron doesn't forgive. Delia had built her entire quiet life around that sentence, and her father had no idea yet just how far she'd carried it. Because here is the part Bolt couldn't have guessed, watching her sweat in that lot. Delia had been getting ready for this morning for the better part of 6 years, and nobody in her life knew it.
It started when she was 18, cleaning out a back room at the county library where they boxed up donated books that never got shelved. Most of it was going to a church sale. In one box, under a stack of water-stained almanacs, she found a hardbound handbook of foundry practice and gray iron metallurgy, printed in 1958, a discard from some vocational program that had closed. The spine was cracked, and somebody had written a name in the front and crossed it out. She was supposed to put it in the sale box. She put it in her coat. She read it the way some people read scripture. Not once, but over and over, the same passages until the language stopped being strange. And somewhere in the second winter of reading it, she understood a thing that the handbook stated plainly and that almost nobody around her had ever had reason to think about. Gray cast iron changes as it ages. When iron is first poured at a foundry, it is full of internal stress, locked-up strain from cooling too fast in one place and slow in another. And that stress makes it treacherous, prone to warping and cracking when you machine it or heat it. Foundries pay good money to relieve that stress, to let castings sit or to bake them in ovens for hours so the strain settles out. But an engine block that has run for 30 years, heated and cooled 10,000 times, vibrated and worked and weathered, is stress relieved by its own long life. The strain is gone. The graphite in it has had decades to sit in a stable form. It is, if you know how to remelt it without ruining it, better iron than most of what comes fresh out of a cupola. Most people saw a cracked engine block, and they saw the end of something. Delia saw the middle. She saw 30 years of free heat treatment sitting in a scrap pile that a man was being paid to carry away. She hauled that first flatbed home in June of 1971 and stacked the blocks behind the machine shed, and Bolt drove off shaking his head and telling the story already. The wheat farmer's girl loading junk iron by hand, and it made a good laugh at the counter for a week. Delia didn't hear the laugh and wouldn't have cared. She washed up, ate supper with her father, who asked where she'd been, and accepted the word Joplin without follow-up. And after the dishes, she took the 1958 handbook down from the shelf in her room where it had lived for 6 years. She opened it to the chapter she knew best, the one on aged and reclaimed iron, and with the pencil stub from her pocket, she underlined a single sentence she had read 200 times before. Then she sat very still and looked at it for a long while, the way you look at a door you have finally decided to open. It was one thing to understand iron on a page, it was another thing entirely to melt it. Delia spent the rest of that summer at the kitchen table after dark, and what she was doing there looked, to anyone glancing in, like a woman doing arithmetic. That is exactly what it was. She was teaching herself to melt gray iron from a book, and the book was honest with her, which is the best thing a book can be. It told her that iron melts near 2,100 degrees Fahrenheit, that you cannot simply build a bigger campfire and get there. that you need a furnace that forces air through burning coke or coal so the fuel gives up its heat fast enough to overcome what the iron pulls away. It told her about the cupola, the oldest reliable design, a vertical stack lined with something that won't melt, charged from the top with alternating layers of coke and iron, air blown in low through openings called tuyères, molten metal collecting at the bottom to be tapped off. It told her, and this mattered more than anything, that the enemy was not heat. The enemy was gas and moisture and haste. She wrote out what she could cast and what she couldn't. She could not cast anything that had to hold pressure like an engine or seal like a valve. Not at first. Not maybe ever from a granary floor. But she lived in a county full of things that were made of plain gray iron and broke and had to be replaced at dealer prices that made grown men wince. Wood stove parts. Nearly every farmhouse burned wood or coal in winter, and stoves ate their own castings, the flue collars that cracked from heat cycling, the grates that burned through, the lids and the frame pieces and the dampers, and pump housings, the heavy iron bodies of the hand pumps and shallow well pumps that stood over every stock tank and back porch well in the country. Iron that cracked in a hard freeze and cost a small fortune to replace through a catalog. Gray iron parts, simple shapes, no pressure, high demand. And the raw material was stacked behind her shed for free. Then she did the thing her father had taught her to do before any decision. She measured the cost twice, and she wrote every line of it down. The furnace itself she could build from salvage, fire brick from a torn-down bakery oven her father knew about, $5 for the load if she hauled it. A steel drum for the shell, free, off the farm. Clay and sand for the lining she could dig and screen herself, call it nothing but labor. The blower to force the air was the one thing she couldn't fake, and she found a used forge blower at a farm sale for $11. Coke to fire it, the good foundry coke, ran her about $1.60 a hundredweight, and she figured $6 for a first run. Sand for the molds, the fine clay-bound molding sand. She could get a pickup load from a foundry supply in Joplin for $4. A crucible ladle, hand-forged from steel plate by a welder she paid $3.40. Pig molds and flasks she built from scrap lumber, nothing. Fire clay to patch, $2. Safety, a leather apron and face shield and a pair of proper gloves, $9. And that was the only line she refused to cut, because she had read what molten iron does to a person who respects it too little. She totaled the column twice, the way she'd been raised to. $41 even, for everything it would take to melt iron on her father's farm. Against that, she set a single flue collar, the kind that cracked in every wood stove in the county, which the hardware in Columbus sold, when they had one, for $14. And she had, stacked behind the shed, enough cracked iron to pour that collar something like 4,000 times. She did not go to her father with excitement, because Standard Vorhees had no use for excitement, and she knew it. She went to him with the notebook. It was a Sunday evening in August, and she set the red spiral notebook open on the kitchen table in front of him, turned so he could read it, the cost column on the left page and the yield on the right. And she said only that she wanted to melt the scrap iron behind the shed into stove parts and pump bodies to sell, and that she wanted to use the far granary to do it, and that she would owe no one a cent to start. Then she stopped talking, which is a skill, and let the numbers do what numbers do to a careful man. Standard read the pages the way he read everything, slowly, his lips moving a little over the figures, his long finger tracking down the cost column and then up the yield column and then down again. He didn't say the idea was foolish. He didn't say it was clever. He got up, took his own folded ledger from his shirt pocket, and copied her numbers into it in his own hand, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously, and also that he did not fully trust her arithmetic yet, and she didn't blame him. Then he closed both books and said he'd think about it. He thought about it for 3 days. She heard nothing. She fed cattle and hoed the garden rows and said nothing back, because pushing standard Vorhees was like pushing a loaded wagon uphill. It only made him set the brake. On the 3rd evening, he came in from the field, washed at the pump, and while she was setting out supper, he said, without preamble, the way he said everything, that the Far granary hadn't held grain in 4 years, and the roof was sound. Then he sat down, and after the blessing, buttering bread, not looking at her, he said the rest of it. Use the Far granary. Owe no one. And if you burn yourself, you'll not do it twice. That was the whole permission. 9 words of yes and a condition and a warning folded into one. Delia said thank you and passed the potatoes and did not smile until she was alone in the dark walking out to look at the granary that was now, as of supper, a foundry. The Far granary sat a 1/4 mile off from the house at the end of a 2-track, a squat frame building with a dirt floor and a good tin roof. And Delia spent the last of that summer and the whole of the fall turning it into something the 1958 handbook would have recognized. She cut a hole in the roof peak for the furnace to breathe. She laid a hearth of the salvaged fire brick and raised her cupola from a steel drum, lining the inside with the clay and sand daub she mixed by hand and dried slow with a low fire over 3 days, because she had read what happens when you rush a refractory lining and drive the water out too fast. It cracks. It fails at the worst possible moment, which is with 200 pounds of molten iron inside it. So she took the 3 days. Measure twice. She set her tuyères low in the shell, 4 of them, and rigged the $11 forge blower to feed them through a wind box she beat out of sheet steel. She built a bench, a molding station, a rack for the flasks. She dug and screened her molding sand and tempered it with water and a little clay until it would hold the shape of her fist and take a clean print off a pattern. And the patterns, the master shapes she'd packed the sand around to make each mold, she carved from close-grained maple. A flue collar, a stove lid, a simple pump housing body, sanding each one smooth and giving it the slight taper a pattern needs so it will pull free of the sand without tearing the mold. Her father came out once a week, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looked at everything, and left mostly without comment. Once he pointed at a tuyère and said it sat too high. She checked her book. He was right. She moved it. Now let me stop and ask you something directly, because this is the heart of the whole thing. When was the last time you looked hard at something everyone around you had already decided was worthless and let yourself wonder if they were wrong? Not out of stubbornness, out of actual attention. Most of us are trained from childhood to see the label instead of the thing. Junk, scrap, waste. And once the label is on, we stop looking. Delia's whole advantage, the only real edge she ever had, was that she kept looking after everyone else had quit. Hold on to that. It comes back around. Word of what she was building got to Joplin before she'd poured a thing, the way anything does in country like that, and it got to Cyrus Bolt, who took it as the funniest thing he'd heard all year. Delia was at the parts counter in Columbus buying a length of iron rod when she heard him behind her, telling the counterman and two other fellows about the Vorhees girl building a whatchamacallit out in a corn crib to melt down the very junk she'd carried off his route. And wasn't that the beat-all? Paying good money to make new junk out of old junk. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. And it was a big, loose, easy laugh. No meanness under it. The laugh of a man who has hauled scrap for 20 years and knows for a certain fact that scrap is scrap. And here was a wheat farmer's daughter about to learn it the hard way, and he'd get to say he told her. Delia turned around. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't color up. She said that the iron in those blocks was stress-relieved gray iron, aged 30 years, denser and more stable than fresh foundry pig, and that remelted carefully, it would cast cleaner stove parts than the ones cracking in his own house right now. Then she paid for a rod and left. Behind her, Bolt whistled and said something about big words, and the counter laughed again, but a little less, because she'd said it plain and she hadn't blinked. And men who work with their hands notice when a person isn't guessing. She fired the cupola for real in October, on a cold, clear morning with frost still on the 2-track, and she did it alone. She charged it the way the book said, a bed of coke lit and burning white, then a layer of iron, then coke, then iron, building the column up the stack. She started the blower, and the thing came alive with a roar that she felt in her chest, and pale smoke poured out the roof hole, and after a while, the way the book promised, the first bright drip of liquid iron gathered at the tap hole, and she opened it, and a rope of molten metal, orange going to yellow-white, ran out into her ladle. It was the most beautiful and the most frightening thing she had ever seen. Her hands did not shake because she'd rehearsed every motion 100 times in her head, but her heart went like a hammer. She carried the full ladle to her molds and poured, and the iron went down into the sand with a hiss and a shower of little sparks, filling the flue collar mold and the 2 stove lids and the pump body. And she stood back and breathed and thought, for 1 clean minute, that she had done it. She broke the first casting out of the sand an hour later, when it had cooled enough to handle. The flue collar came out gray and heavy and roughly the right shape. And it was ruined. The surface was pocked all over with little holes, some the size of a pinhead, and some she could have laid a pencil in. And when she tapped it against the bench, a corner broke clean off, and the fracture inside was full of the same gas holes, a honeycomb where solid iron should have been. It was porous straight through. It would have cracked in a stove the first cold night. She set it down on the sand floor and stood over it a long time, alone in the granary in the failing light. $41 and 6 years of reading in her hands, and it had come out full of holes. She did not cry, and she did not quit, though the second one was closer than she'd ever tell. She picked up the ruined collar and carried it to the kitchen table and set it under the lamp and got out the 1958 handbook in the red notebook. And she did the only thing she knew how to do, which was to figure out exactly why. Porosity in a casting, the book told her, is gas that had nowhere to go. Iron pours at better than 2,000 degrees, and whatever moisture or air it meets flashes instantly to steam and vapor. And if that gas can't escape the mold before the metal freezes around it, it stays trapped as holes. There were 3 ways she could have let gas in, and she had a cold feeling she'd done all 3. Her molding sand had been too wet, She'd tempered it heavy that morning because it was crumbling in the cold, and the water in it had turned to steam the instant the iron hit. Her mold had no vents, no little channels pricked through the sand to let gas run out, so what steam did form had been driven straight back into the metal. And she'd poured too cold. She was almost sure of it. She'd hurried the ladle because it frightened her. An iron that's cooling as it fills doesn't stay liquid long enough for the gas to rise and clear before it sets. Wet sand, no venting, low temperature. 3 mistakes, and the iron, as her father would say, does not forgive even one. She lay awake that night, and this is the part she never dressed up when she told it later. She lay in the dark and let herself count the whole cost. Not the $41, that was nothing, but the 6 years of secret reading and the way Bolt had laughed, and the way her father had copied her numbers into his own ledger like a man hedging a bet. And she thought about how much cleaner her life would be if she just carried that broken collar out to the scrap and let the county have its laugh, and went back to being a wheat farmer's daughter who tried a strange thing once. Quitting was right there. It had a real shape. And what kept her from it wasn't pride, and wasn't even the iron. It was the sentence in the handbook she'd underlined 6 years before, the one that said aged gray iron was superior. Because she knew that sentence was true, whether or not she was good enough to prove it. And it seemed to her, at 2 in the morning, that the worst thing a person could do was know a true thing and lack the nerve to make it real. So she got up before dawn and rebuilt everything. She dried her molding sand and tempered it lighter, just damp enough to hold a print, testing it against her fist the way the book said, and no wetter. She rebuilt her flasks, and this time, before she poured, she took a length of stiff wire and pricked venting holes down through the sand all around each mold cavity. Dozens of fine channels for the gas to climb out through. And she rebuilt the way she ran the melt. She let the cupola run hotter and longer before she tapped it, and she watched the color of the iron in the ladle, learning to read that white yellow that meant the metal was hot enough to stay fully liquid all the way through the pour and hold long enough for the gas to rise and clear. She stopped hurrying. She poured in one smooth, steady stream, high and hot, the way the book showed, and she filled the mold in a single, unbroken flow. She broke that casting out the next afternoon, and it changed her life. The flue collar came out of the sand gray and clean and dead true. No pocks on the surface, no honeycomb inside when she filed a test edge. Just solid, close-grained iron with the fine gray fracture the handbook said was exactly what good aged iron should show. It rang when she tapped it. It fit the pattern to the 16th. She weighed the iron she'd used and the coke she'd burned, and she sat down with the pencil and did the arithmetic on that one collar, and the material in it. The iron that had come to her free and the fuel in the sand came to about $1.90. $1.90 in her hand, sitting on the granary floor, against $14 at the hardware in Columbus when they had one in stock, which was seldom. She held it a long time. Then she wrote the number down, once, and underlined it, and went to find her father. For a while, things actually seemed fine, better than fine, and Delia would remember those first years as the good, easy climb before she understood how quickly the whole country could go under. Standard held that first perfect collar in the lamplight a long time, turned it over, tapped it, ran his thumb over the clean casting, and finally set it down on the ledger and said, quietly, not looking up, that it was better iron than the one that had cracked in their own kitchen stove. Then he wrote something in the pocket ledger. That was as close to "you were right" as Standard Vorhees came, And it was enough. And it cost him nothing because he had never been against her. He had only been waiting for proof the way a careful man waits. And now the proof was in his hand, and he was satisfied.
The parts sold themselves, which is the only kind of selling that lasts. She took a box of flue collars and stove lids to the hardware in Columbus, and the man there, who'd been paying a distributor $14 and waiting 3 weeks for collars that cracked anyway, bought the box and asked for more. A neighbor's pump body froze and split in November, and instead of ordering from a catalog for a month's wait and $30, he drove to the Vorhees place, and Delia cast him a new housing off her maple pattern in 2 days for a third of the price. And it fit, and it held. And the neighbor told 2 other men, and those men told the co-op. And word traveled the way water travels on flat ground. Not fast and not dramatic, just steadily downhill and into every low place until the whole field is covered. By spring, she was casting 3 days a week. By the next winter, she'd worn out her first maple patterns and carved better ones, and added a dozen new shapes, grates and dampers and well pump parts, and the heavy flat weights that farmers hung on everything. Somewhere in there, I should just say plainly, if stories about people who saw worth in what everyone else threw away are the kind of thing you want more of, you're in the right place, and you do well to stick around, because there are a good many of them, and they don't get told enough. That's all. Back to Delia. Cyrus Bolt came out to the farm on a gray afternoon in the second winter, alone, and Delia saw his truck come up the 2-track and set down her ladle and waited. He climbed out slow and stood in the granary doorway, with his hands in the pockets of his brown work jacket and the unlit cigarette behind his ear. And he looked around at the cupola and the racks of finished castings and the neat bins of pattern shapes, and for a while he didn't say anything at all. Then he walked over and picked up a flue collar off the rack and turned it in his big, freckled hands and tapped it with a knuckle and heard it ring. And Delia watched a man's whole certainty about the world rearrange itself behind his eyes. He set the collar down. He said 3 words. I was wrong. That was all. And you could see what it cost him. Because a man who has been sure of a thing for 20 years does not give it up lightly. And he gave it up standing in the very building he'd laughed about at the counter. But Bolt was a decent man, which is a different thing from a right one, and he didn't stop at the apology. He said the shop in Joplin wasn't the only one paying to get rid of cracked iron. There were 3 or 4 more within an hour that were doing the same, and that he ran routes past all of them, and that if she wanted, he'd cull the gray iron blocks out and bring them to her instead of the scale, and she could pay him what the scale paid, which was next to nothing, and everybody would come out ahead. Delia thought about it for exactly as long as it took to see that it was true, and she said she'd need a receipt for every load. Bolt laughed, the same big, easy laugh, only now it had something else in it, and he said she would get her receipt. And that was how the running haul began that carried, over the years, close to 4,000 cracked engine blocks onto the Vorhees farm, delivered by the man who had once been paid to make them disappear. You know what 18% interest did to farms that had borrowed to grow through the good years of the late 70s. You have maybe heard the number thrown around, but let me tell you what it looked like in one county. In the middle of the 1970s, land prices had climbed and grain prices had climbed, and the banks and the government both said the same thing: expand, borrow, buy more ground, plant fence row to fence row. And thousands of good, careful farmers did exactly what everyone they trusted told them to do. They signed notes on land at prices that assumed the good years would keep coming. Then at the turn of the decade, the bottom fell out of everything at once. Grain prices collapsed. Land values collapsed under the farmers who'd borrowed against them.
And the interest on their operating notes, the money they borrowed every spring just to put the crop in, climbed to 18% and higher, so that a man could bring in a full harvest and still owe more at the end of the year than he had at the start. What that did to Cherokee County was quiet and total. There were farm sales every week through 1980 and 1981. The machinery lined up in a muddy lot, and the auctioneer's chant and the neighbors standing around, not bidding much because they were in the same boat. Families that had held ground for 3 generations signed it over to the bank and moved to town, or moved away. It wasn't that they were lazy or foolish. Most of them were harder workers than Delia and knew their business cold. They had simply done the reasonable thing. They had borrowed to grow, and the reasonable thing turned out to be the thing that killed them, because it exposed them to a risk that had nothing to do with how well they farmed. Delia survived it, and the foundry not only survived, but grew straight through the worst of it. And the reason was not that she was smarter than her neighbors. The reason was that she owed nobody anything, and her raw material cost her nothing. Standard's 9 words at the supper table, "Owe no one," had walled her off from the exact catastrophe that was breaking better operations all around her. She had no operating note, so 18% interest was just a number in the newspaper to her. She had no land debt because the foundry sat on paid ground, and her material didn't rise or fall with any market because it was cracked iron that men were still, even in the collapse, paying to get rid of. While the price of everything a farmer sold was falling through the floor, the price of a good iron pump housing that a man needed and couldn't afford to buy new went the other way. And Delia's castings, cheap and sound and made from free metal, were exactly what a county full of broke, careful people wanted. And here's the thing that mattered most inside the family. The Vorhees wheat farm, 320 acres, felt the collapse too, because grain prices don't care whose field they fall on. There were 2 years in there when the wheat barely covered its own cost of going in the ground. But the farm had no note either, thanks to a lifetime of Standard's refusal, and in the worst of it, the cash coming off Delia's granary foundry, steady and small and utterly reliable, carried the household through the lean seasons when the wheat couldn't. The daughter's strange hobby, the junk iron notion the county had laughed about, turned out to be the thing that kept the family's own ground under the family's own feet. Standard never made a speech about it. He just started, without being asked, keeping the foundry's books in a second ledger alongside the farm's, in his own careful hand. And the fact that he kept them said everything a speech would have. They came out the far side of the collapse the way you come out of a hard winter, thinner and quieter and still there. And from there the figures only ever climbed. 1982, the foundry cleared a little over $9,000 for the year. 1985, past $20,000, with 2 men hired part-time to mold and clean castings while Delia ran the melt. By the end of the 1980s, she'd built a proper foundry building beside the old granary, a real cupola with a real charging deck, and the operation was booking better than $40,000 a year in a county where that was serious money. All of it out of iron that arrived on Cyrus Bolt's truck for less than the scale would have paid. The march of the numbers after that is the least dramatic and most satisfying part of the whole story, and it went on for 30 years. The Vorhees foundry never grew fast because Delia never borrowed to grow fast, and it never had a bad year that threatened it because it had no exposure to the things that make bad years. It grew the way a hedgerow grows, a little every season, unstoppable precisely because it is slow. Through the 90s, the product line broadened from stove parts and pump bodies into architectural castings, gate finials and fence caps, and the ornamental iron that came back into fashion, and hand-cast cookware, and reproduction parts for old machinery that no one else would touch because the runs were too small to interest a real foundry. Small runs of good iron from free stock were the one thing Delia could do that nobody big could be bothered to. By the 2000s, they were shipping castings out of state. The wider world found her the way it always finds these people, late and by accident. A writer for a trade magazine that covered small foundry and metal casting work came through the region in 2014 chasing a different story. Heard about a woman in the Kansas corn and wheat country who ran a cupola out of a converted granary on reclaimed engine block iron and drove out to see it because it sounded too strange to be true. He spent a day watching Delia pour, by then a lean woman near 70 with the same dark braid gone mostly silver and the same red notebook in her breast pocket. And he wrote a long piece about her that ran under the title, more or less, that the best gray iron in 3 states came out of a Kansas granary and was made from what everyone else threw away. After that came the occasional visitor, a phone call from a foundry association asking her to speak at a meeting, which she declined, and a steady, quiet trickle of younger people who wanted to see how it was done. She let them watch. She didn't explain herself much. The castings explained her. By 2019, the ledger that Standard had started keeping in his own hand back in the collapse, and that Delia had kept up in hers after he passed, showed that the foundry had booked, cumulatively, over $2,100,000 across its life. Every dollar of it traceable back to iron the county had been paying to throw away, and a 1958 handbook a library was going to sell for a dime. That was the summer Marion came. Delia Vorhees was Delia's brother's girl, 22 years old, home from a state college engineering program with a laptop bag over her shoulder and a spiral notebook of her own. And she'd grown up half knowing the family legend without ever paying it much mind, the way you don't pay attention to the mountain you were born looking at. She came out to the foundry on a July morning and stood in the doorway the way 3 generations of skeptical men had stood in doorways, and watched her great-aunt tap a heat of iron that had come, that very load, off a route Cyrus Bolt's grandson now ran. And something in Marion woke up. The same thing that had woken up in Delia in a library back room 40 years before. She'd been reading, she said, about the foundry sand, about how much of it a working foundry uses and throws away. Spent molding sand that most operations pay to landfill because once it's been through enough heats, it's considered used up. Millions of tons of it a year across the industry, hauled off at a cost, treated as waste. And she'd been reading the chemistry of it, and she thought, she wasn't sure, but she thought, that spent foundry sand could be reclaimed and reconditioned and run again almost indefinitely, and that beyond that, the surplus could be sold into concrete and road base and soil work. That a thing the whole industry paid to get rid of was in fact a material somebody smart enough was going to make money on. She had it worked out in her notebook. The cost to recondition against the cost to buy new sand and the cost to dump old. And she turned the notebook around on the workbench so Delia could read it, the numbers on the left and the yield on the right. And then she stopped talking and waited. Delia Vorhees looked down at her great-niece's arithmetic in the light coming through the granary door, and she was quiet for a moment. And then she said the thing her own father had said to her a lifetime ago. The thing she'd carried through 6 years of secret reading and 40 years of iron. "You measure twice," she said, "because the iron doesn't forgive." Marion said she knew. She'd measured it 3 times. Delia almost smiled at that. And here's the difference 40 years makes. When Delia had laid her numbers on the kitchen table at 24, her father had taken 3 days to say yes, and he'd been right to, because that is how a careful person protects the young from the risk they can't yet see. Delia had waited those 3 days. She had earned her way to the far granary, one silent hour at a time. But Delia had spent her whole life learning what her father was slower to learn, which is that the person standing in front of you, seeing worth in the discarded thing, is almost never wrong about the worth, only early. She did not need 3 days. She looked at Marion's notebook, and she looked at the young woman who had made it, and she said yes right then, standing on the sand floor with the heat cooling in the flasks behind her. Yes, use the back building. And then, because some things are worth passing down whole, she added the rest of it. Oh, no one. The far granary still stands at the end of the 2-track in Cherokee County, and the cupola beside it still runs. The iron still comes in cracked and dead off a scrapper's truck, paid for at less than the scale. Standard Vorhees' pocket ledger sits in a drawer in the office, and the second one, in 2 hands now, sits open on the desk. Marion runs the sand reclamation line out of the back building, and it turns a profit on material the rest of the industry pays to bury. Cyrus Bolt's grandson still makes the Joplin run. There is a 1958 metallurgy handbook on a shelf, spine cracked, a name in the front crossed out, one sentence underlined in pencil, worn nearly to nothing from being read. Delia planted a foundry in a wheat county. Out of iron the whole county was throwing away. They called it a hobby. The farms that borrowed to grow went under at 18%. The foundry, which owed no one and paid nothing for its iron, did not.